Coming up next, it's Huckleberry Hound on Boomerang from Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Yogi Bear on Boomerang from Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Top Cat on Boomerang from Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Josie and the Pussycats on Boomerang from Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the Flintstones on Boomerang from Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the Jetsons on Boomerang from Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Yogi's Gang on Boomerang from Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's the Charlie Brown and Snoopy Show on Boomerang from Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Popeye on Boomerang from Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry on Boomerang from Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo, Where Are You?
On Boomerang from Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Looney Tunes on Boomerang from Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Dexter's Laboratory on Boomerang. It's Mike, Lou, and Og coming up next, right here on Boomerang.
Coming up next, it's Johnny Test on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Foster's Hope for Imaginary Friends on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Codename Kids Next Door on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's JB Looney Tunes on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry Tales on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's a pup named Scooby-Doo on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's What's New, Scooby-Doo on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Ed, Ed, and Eddie on Boomerang. Coming up next, Courage the Cowardly Dog on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the Powerpuff Girls on Boomerang.
Coming up next, it's Well Well Rugby
On Boomerang.
Coming up next, it's Lazy Town
On Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Caillou on Boomerang.
Jokey is up next.
On Boomerang.
Next on
Boomerang.
Happily Ever After Fairy Tales for Every Child. Next on
Boomerang. I Spy.
Coming up next, it's Jellystone.
Right here on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Duck Dodgers. On Boomerang.
Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry Kids.
On Boomerang.
Bluey is coming up.
Here on Boomerang.
Next, it's Dan Versus.
On Boomerang.
From Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Pamphlasma.
On Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Hi Puppy Amiyumi. On Boomerang from Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Crypto the Superdog. On Boomerang from Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Tiny Toon Adventures.
Right here on Boomerang.
Coming up next, it's Pink Panther. On Boomerang.
Coming up next, it's the life and times of Junior Berlin. On Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the Snoopy Show. On Boomerang from Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Woody Woodpecker. On Boomerang from Cartoon Network.